Yeah, she's got a slightly fat belly. I never
Well,
even
I've got his
suspect.
pock marks, you know.
You think he dominates you?
Joking.
In your real life?
There are people who become famous, and then there are people who become something else entirely. Permanent, almost mythological. People whose names you heard as a child without fully understanding why they mattered, only knowing that they did. Elizabeth Taylor was one of those people. She was born with violet eyes and a kind of beauty that made the world stop and stare. She became a star before she was a teenager, won 2 Academy Awards, fell in love harder than most people ever dare to, fought battles that would have broken anyone else, and kept going anyway. This is the life and tragic ending of Elizabeth Taylor. Part 1. A child born into 2 worlds. Elizabeth Rosamond Taylor came into the world on February 27, 1932, in Hampstead, London. Her parents were Americans. Her father, Francis Taylor, was an art dealer, and her mother, Sarah, had once been a stage actress. The family lived comfortably in England, moving in circles that included actors, artists, and socialites. Francis's gallery attracted the cultured and the well-connected, and the Taylor household was, by all accounts, a lively and socially rich place. London was home, and Elizabeth grew up knowing a certain kind of graceful life, with an English garden, English neighbors, and an English accent that would stay with her on film long after she had left the country behind. Sarah Taylor was a woman with ambition. Her own had been redirected into motherhood, but it hadn't disappeared. She was attentive to her daughter in ways that could shade into pushiness, and she recognized early that Elizabeth was not an ordinary-looking child. There was something composed about her face, even in infancy, that arrested the eye. But Europe in the late 1930s was not a safe place to raise a family. With war growing closer on the horizon and the situation in Germany worsening by the month, Francis and Sarah Taylor made the decision to return to the United States. In 1939, when Elizabeth was just 7 years old, the family packed up and moved to Los Angeles. They would never return to England to live. Los Angeles was a world unto itself in those days. The great Hollywood studios were at the height of their power, and the city hummed with the energy of people who had come from everywhere to make something of themselves. For the Taylors, settling in California was a practical choice. Francis eventually opened an art gallery on the Sunset Strip, and his clientele naturally included people connected to the film industry. The gossip columnist Hedda Hopper was a friend of Sarah's, and she took an early interest in the Taylor family's remarkable-looking daughter. It was through these social connections that Elizabeth's mother began to wonder if a career in pictures might be possible. Elizabeth was a striking child. That much was obvious to everyone who saw her. She had dark hair, pale skin, and those remarkable eyes, a deep violet blue with a double row of eyelashes that made people look twice. Later in life, the double lashes would be documented as a genetic mutation, dystichiasis, a rare condition that in most cases causes irritation to the eyes, but in Elizabeth's case seems to have only deepened the uncanny quality of her gaze. Even as a little girl, there was something about her that the camera was drawn to, something the lens responded to that went beyond ordinary prettiness. In 1941, a family friend arranged for Elizabeth to audition at Universal Pictures. The studio signed her to a contract, and she made her film debut the following year, in 1942, in a small comedy called There's One Born Every Minute. She was 10 years old. Universal, however, did not see a great future in her and dropped her contract after that one picture. One studio executive reportedly said the child had nothing. That assessment would age rather poorly. MGM quickly moved in. In late 1942, producer Samuel Marks arranged an audition for Elizabeth when the studio was looking for a child actress with an English accent to appear in Lassie Come Home. She fit perfectly. After a trial contract of 3 months, MGM offered her a full 7-year agreement in January 1943. She appeared in Lassie Come Home, then in small uncredited roles in Jane Eyre and The White Cliffs of Dover. The studio was patient, building towards something larger. They had something in mind for her, and the role that would change everything was already being planned. Part 2. National Velvet and the Birth of a Star. There was a novel by Enid Bagnold, published in 1935, about a young girl named Velvet Brown who wins a horse in a raffle and dreams of riding him in Britain's Grand National Steeplechase. MGM had owned the rights to it for years and was finally ready to bring it to the screen. When they cast 12-year-old Elizabeth Taylor as Velvet Brown, they weren't entirely sure she was right for it. She was too short, they said, so production was delayed for months while she grew. During that time, she threw herself into horseback riding, determined to make the role her own. She trained relentlessly. In fact, during one riding session before filming even began, she was thrown from the horse and broke her back, an injury that went undetected for years, and one that would cause her chronic pain for the rest of her life. She finished the film anyway. MGM also had other plans for Elizabeth's appearance. The studio wanted to straighten her teeth, dye her hair, and even proposed having her work under the name Virginia. Taylor and her parents refused the most invasive suggestions. She would be Elizabeth Taylor, her own name, her own face. And the studio, however reluctantly, accepted it. A standard part of the studio system in those years was the complete ownership of a contract player's image, and it ground up plenty of young careers. Elizabeth's stubbornness on these early points was a preview of how she would operate for the rest of her life. National Velvet was released on Christmas Day, 1944. The response was immediate and extraordinary. Critics ran out of superlatives, audiences filled theaters. The New York Times praised her warmth and grace on screen. James Agee, writing for The Nation, called her rapturously beautiful. MGM had a genuine star on their hands, and they knew it. Elizabeth was 12 years old. Elizabeth herself later said that her childhood ended when she became a star. MGM began managing almost every aspect of her life: what she wore, who she was seen with, what she said in interviews. The studio machinery was all-consuming, and she was inside it now completely. The studio wasted no time deploying her. Over the next several years, Elizabeth appeared in film after film: Courage of Lassie, Cynthia, A Date with Judy, Little Women. MGM worked her steadily, carefully shaping her image as she moved from girlhood into young womanhood. They placed her alongside other young contract players, Mickey Rooney, Judy Garland, Margaret O'Brien, and cultivated the sense that she was part of a golden generation of talent. Still, something real was being built. By the time she was a teenager, Elizabeth Taylor was one of the most recognized faces in the world. The transition from child star to adult actress is treacherous in Hollywood. Many have tried it and failed. Elizabeth made it look almost effortless. Her role in Father of the Bride in 1950, opposite Spencer Tracy, showed she could hold her own in polished adult comedy. Then came A Place in the Sun in 1951, directed by George Stevens, in which she starred alongside Montgomery Clift. It was a dramatic departure, dark, serious, emotionally complex, and she rose to meet it. For the first time, critics began to talk about her not just as a beauty, but as a genuine actress. She and Clift became close friends during the production, a friendship that would last until his death in 1966. He was, by many accounts, one of the most important people in her life, someone who took her seriously as a performer at a time when many others were still caught up in how she looked. Their friendship would be tested in 1956, when Clift was badly injured in a car accident outside a dinner party at her home. Elizabeth was the first to reach him, holding him, keeping him conscious. She very likely saved his life that night. Part 3: The Years That Shaped Her. The 1950s were both brilliant and painful for Elizabeth Taylor in ways that mirrored each other almost perfectly. The higher her career climbed, the more turbulent her personal life became. On the screen, she was extraordinary. In 1952, she starred in Ivanhoe alongside Robert Taylor and Joan Fontaine, one of MGM's most ambitious historical epics of the era. Her performance in Giant in 1956, alongside Rock Hudson and James Dean, who died in a car accident before the film was even released, cemented her status as one of Hollywood's most bankable stars. Raintree County in 1957 earned her her first Academy Award nomination, though she lost to Joanne Woodward for The Three Faces of Eve. Cat on a Hot Tin Roof in 1958, in which she played Maggie opposite Paul Newman, was widely considered among the finest work of her career. Suddenly, Last Summer in 1959 brought her a second nomination. She lost again, this time to Simone Signoret. The roles were getting bigger, more demanding, and she was rising to every one of them. She was resented by some in the industry for her privilege and her image, but the camera did not lie, and neither did the box office numbers. Off-screen, her life was considerably more complicated. She had married for the first time in May 1950, at 18 years old, to Conrad Nicky Hilton Jr., the heir to the Hilton Hotel fortune. MGM had actually organized much of the wedding ceremony as promotion for Father of the Bride, using the real-life event to generate publicity for the film in which Taylor played a bride. It was a blurring of reality and performance that would become a pattern. Her personal life, whether she invited the attention or not, was always also public property. What should have been a fairy tale turned into something much darker. Hilton was physically and emotionally abusive. Elizabeth suffered a miscarriage and endured months of a marriage that had become frightening. She filed for divorce after less than a year. In 1952, she married British actor Michael Wilding, a man considerably older than she was and well regarded on the English stage. They had 2 sons together, Michael Howard Wilding Jr., born in 1953, and Christopher Edward Wilding, born in 1955. But the marriage wore thin over time. Wilding's career was struggling in Hollywood, and the imbalance in their public profiles, she was soaring while his trajectory was falling, created a strain that was difficult to overcome. They separated in 1956 and divorced in January 1957. Elizabeth always spoke of him fondly afterward, and when Wilding died in 1979, she was reportedly deeply saddened by the news. Then came Mike Todd. Todd was a producer, large in personality, extravagant in gesture, a man who filled every room he entered and seemed constitutionally incapable of doing anything on a small scale. He was 25 years older than Elizabeth, at the height of his own fame after producing the Oscar-winning Around the World in 80 days and entirely unintimidated by her celebrity. She described his marriage proposal as something he announced rather than asked. She loved that about him. They married in Acapulco in February 1957, and by all accounts, Elizabeth was happier than she had been in years. They had a daughter together, Elizabeth Liza Frances Todd, born in August 1957. Todd threw Elizabeth a birthday party at Madison Square Garden, attended by 18,000 guests, broadcast on CBS. He named his private plane the Liz. Their life together was vivid and excessive and full of joy, and she later said that he was the man she would have stayed with forever. On March 22, 1958, Mike Todd was killed when the Liz crashed in New Mexico. He had asked Elizabeth to fly with him that night. She stayed behind because she was ill with a cold. She was 26 years old, a widow with 3 children, and utterly shattered. The grief was physical, visible, almost operatic in its intensity. She returned to filming Cat on a Hot Tin Roof 3 weeks later because the studio's financial pressures left her little choice, and because Todd had died in debt, and because working was the only time she could make herself function. In grief, she turned to Todd's closest friend, a singer named Eddie Fisher. Fisher was married at the time to actress Debbie Reynolds, a couple the press had mythologized as America's sweethearts, young, attractive, wholesome, the very image of post-war American happiness. When Taylor and Fisher began their relationship, the public turned on Elizabeth with a ferocity that surprised even Hollywood. She was painted as a homewrecker, vilified in newspapers, condemned in fan mail. Debbie Reynolds, who handled the situation with quiet dignity, became a figure of national sympathy. Taylor married Fisher in 1959, becoming his wife and absorbing the hatred of anyone who had loved the idea of that other, simpler marriage. What made the situation particularly strange was that Debbie Reynolds and Elizabeth Taylor were not enemies. Not really. They had known each other for years. But the narrative had been written, and the public had their villain. In 1960, she won the Academy Award for Best Actress for her performance in Butterfield 8, a film she had reportedly despised making, calling the role degrading and the script beneath her. The previous year, she had nearly died from pneumonia during the early stages of Cleopatra's London production, requiring an emergency tracheotomy. Some believed the Academy was partly acknowledging the nearness of her death. Whatever the reasons, the award was hers, and it was only the beginning. Part 4: Cleopatra, Le Scandal, and Richard Burton. The production of Cleopatra is one of the most chaotic stories in Hollywood history. The film had been in development for years, changing directors, locations, and casts before it finally landed on Elizabeth Taylor as its star. She had negotiated a salary of $1 million to play the Egyptian queen, the first actor, male or female, ever to receive that sum for a single picture. When filming began in London in 1960, the British weather proved disastrous. Elizabeth fell gravely ill with pneumonia and very nearly died. The London footage was largely scrapped. A new director was brought in, Joseph L. Mankiewicz, and production relocated to Rome, where the film started over almost from scratch. By the time it wrapped, Cleopatra had cost somewhere between $31 and $44 million, nearly bankrupting 20th Century Fox. But all of that was almost beside the point, because what happened in Rome eclipsed everything else. Richard Burton arrived on the set in January 1962 to play Mark Antony. He was a Welsh actor with a volcanic stage reputation, a magnificent voice, and a gift for self-destruction that rivaled anyone in the industry. He was also married to Sybil Burton, his first wife. Elizabeth later described the morning they filmed their first real scene together. Burton showed up shaking, hungover, and vulnerable, and asked her to hold his coffee cup up to his lips because his hands wouldn't steady. She said that was the moment she was gone. What followed became known simply as Le Scandal. Italian paparazzi photographed the two of them on a yacht off the island of Ischia, unmistakably close, unmistakably more than colleagues. The photographs went around the world in hours. The Vatican's newspaper condemned Elizabeth for what it called erotic vagrancy. The press was merciless. The scandal was enormous. And yet neither of them stopped. Burton later described the relationship as something that overtook him in a way he had not expected. He had assumed it would be like his other on-set romances, intense, but ultimately temporary. It was not. Their connection was unlike anything either of them had known, and it was also, from the beginning, a thing made partly of fire. They drank heavily together. They fought violently. They loved each other with a completeness that neither could seem to manage anywhere else. Cleopatra was finally released in June 1963. Taylor and Burton were absent from the premiere, exhausted by the whole ordeal. Despite the troubled production and the mixed critical reception, it was the highest-grossing film of 1963. Their off-screen romance had made it unmissable. After Fisher and Burton's respective divorces were finalized, Elizabeth and Richard married on March 15, 1964, in Montreal. It was her fifth marriage and his second. They were arguably the most famous couple on Earth. Over the next decade, they made 11 films together, including Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf in 1966, directed by Mike Nichols. The film was an adaptation of Edward Albee's play, a story about a university couple tearing each other apart over the course of a single boozy, bruising night. The characters, George and Martha, were acidic, wounded, and cruel to each other in ways that felt uncomfortably close to home. Taylor played Martha without vanity, unglamorous, bloated with drink, screaming across rooms. It was as far from the delicate beauty of National Velvet as a role could be, and she was ferocious in it. She won her second Academy Award for Best Actress. Critics who had spent years treating her primarily as a glamorous commodity, as a beautiful face and expensive costumes, had to admit she was something considerably more. The film also earned Burton a nomination, though he did not win. It was one of the strange tensions of their relationship. She was the bigger star. She had the Oscars, the higher salary, the greater claim on Hollywood's attention. He was widely regarded as the finer stage actor, the one with the more serious artistic credentials. Neither resented the other exactly, but the imbalance was always there, a quiet pressure beneath everything else. Burton gave her extraordinary gifts throughout their marriage. Most famously, the Taylor-Burton diamond, a 69.42-carat pear-shaped stone he purchased at auction in 1969 for just over $1 million, at the time the highest price ever paid at auction for a jewel. Elizabeth wore it on a necklace. She later said that when she put it on, she could feel the weight of it, and she liked that. Their lifestyle was extravagant, peripatetic, and frequently exhausting. Private yachts, suites at the finest hotels in the world, a traveling court of assistants and friends and hangers-on. They were photographed everywhere, written about constantly, and watched by the entire world. They divorced in June 1974. There were years of attempting to live separately, of trying to be two people who had simply been together for a long time and had now moved on. Neither of them managed it convincingly. They remarried in October 1975 in a small ceremony in Botswana. They divorced again in 1976. After the second divorce, they continued to stay in contact, to write letters, to speak on the phone, to find reasons to be in the same cities. Old habits, old bonds. Some connections don't fully dissolve, no matter how many legal documents say they should. Richard Burton died of a cerebral hemorrhage on August 5, 1984, at the age of 58. Elizabeth later said she had still been in love with him when he died. Part 5. After the Storm. The years after Burton were different ones, quieter in some ways, and in other ways more complicated than ever. One chapter of Elizabeth's life that rarely got the attention it deserved was her conversion to Judaism. In 1959, while married to Eddie Fisher, she formally converted, studying under a rabbi and taking the Hebrew name Elisheba Rachel. She had been drawn to the faith for years, partly through friendships, partly through her own spiritual searching. She remained Jewish for the rest of her life and was active in Jewish causes throughout her later years. It was one of the more private dimensions of who she was, rarely discussed in the press, which tended to prefer the dramas. In 1976, Elizabeth married for the 6th time to John Warner, a former Secretary of the Navy who was running for a seat in the United States Senate. They had met on a blind date when Warner escorted her to a dinner hosted by Queen Elizabeth II at the British Embassy in Washington. It was an unlikely pairing, a Hollywood legend and a Virginia politician. But Elizabeth threw herself into his campaign with genuine energy. She traveled the state, spoke at rallies, put her name and her face behind a man most people had never heard of. He won his Senate seat, and he later gave her full credit for the victory. But life in Washington did not suit Elizabeth Taylor. The structured, formal world of a senator's wife, the receptions, the protocol, the careful management of one's public statements, felt like wearing a costume she hadn't chosen. She gained weight during those years, struggled with boredom, and with a growing sense that she was disappearing into someone else's narrative. The marriage lasted 6 years and ended in 1982. During this period, her health was deteriorating in ways that had been building for decades. The back injury from National Velvet, never properly treated in those early years, had compounded into chronic pain that required increasingly strong medication. She had become dependent on prescription pain medication and alcohol, a combination that was slowly eroding her. In December 1983, she checked herself into the Betty Ford Center in Rancho Mirage, California, for 7 weeks of treatment. She was the first major celebrity to openly admit to entering the clinic, a decision that required a particular kind of courage, given how fiercely the entertainment industry policed its own image in those years. She spoke about it publicly, without shame, and the acknowledgement itself was a kind of groundbreaking act. In 1988, she published a memoir called Elizabeth Takes Off, which dealt frankly with her weight, her addiction, and her recovery. She was not in the habit of hiding. In 1991, while at the Betty Ford Center for a second stay, she met Larry Fortensky, a construction worker who was there for his own treatment. They began a relationship and married that same year in a ceremony at Michael Jackson's Neverland Ranch. Elizabeth and Jackson had become genuine close friends by then, and the wedding reflected the particular world she inhabited, one where extraordinary things happened as a matter of course. They divorced in 1996. She said afterward that she would not marry again, and she kept that promise. Her final marriage behind her, Elizabeth turned her attention to something that had been consuming her for years: the AIDS crisis. Part 6. The Cause She Chose. In 1985, Elizabeth Taylor lost one of her closest friends. Rock Hudson, the actor she had worked alongside in Giant all those years before, died from complications related to AIDS. He was 59 years old. His death was one of the first to put a genuinely famous face on the epidemic, and in doing so, it forced conversations that much of America had been carefully avoiding. For years, the crisis had been largely invisible in mainstream public discourse, treated as something that happened to certain people in certain communities, nothing that needed to concern the broader public. Hudson's death made that position untenable. Elizabeth had been watching all of this for years before Hudson died. She had friends who were ill. She had sat with people who were suffering and been appalled by the silence around them. The fear, the stigma, the refusal of many institutions and individuals to even acknowledge what was happening. When Hudson died publicly, she was already engaged. His passing became the moment she moved from personal grief to public action. Later that same year, she co-founded the American Foundation for AIDS Research, AMFAR, alongside Dr. Matilda Krim, a biomedical scientist who had been working on the epidemic for years. The organization focused on funding research and raising the scientific and public profile of the crisis. Elizabeth brought what no scientist could: global celebrity, the ability to fill a room, and a willingness to stand in front of cameras and say the words that others were still afraid to say out loud. She testified before Congress. She wrote letters. She made phone calls to politicians who did not want to take them. She attended fundraisers and galas and vigils. She was photographed with patients, sitting with them, holding their hands at a time when there was still widespread, irrational fear that casual contact could transmit the virus. She did this deliberately, knowing the photographs would be published, knowing they would say something that words alone could not. In 1991, she established the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation, which focused specifically on providing direct care and services to people living with the disease, not just research funding, but the practical, immediate help that patients needed day to day. She did this when it was still deeply uncomfortable for a beloved public figure to be associated with AIDS, when the disease was still largely misunderstood, when those who suffered from it were often treated as shameful and invisible. Elizabeth Taylor made them visible. She showed up. She kept showing up year after year for the rest of her life. Her advocacy drew praise from across the political spectrum and criticism from some who felt that celebrity involvement trivialized serious medical research. She ignored the criticism. The money came in, the awareness grew, and the foundation continued its work long after she was gone. In 2000, Queen Elizabeth II made her a Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire, in recognition of both her career and her decades of humanitarian work. The girl from London had come back, in a sense, formally honored by the country where she was born. Part 7. The Final Years. The later years were quiet by the standards Elizabeth Taylor had always lived by. She still appeared at events when her health permitted, still gave interviews, still wore extraordinary jewelry, and signed her name to causes she believed in. But the body that had carried her through so much was finally asking for something different. Her health had become the dominant fact of her daily life. By her own count, she had nearly died 4 times over the course of her life. She had endured more than 30 surgeries, treated conditions ranging from scoliosis, which she had been born with, to broken bones, pneumonia, a hysterectomy, skin cancer, phlebitis, hip replacements, and the removal of a benign brain tumor in 1997. According to one biographer, she suffered more than 70 illnesses, injuries, and accidents requiring hospitalization over the span of her lifetime. The back injury from National Velvet had never fully resolved. She had been born with scoliosis. The years of physical pain and the medications used to manage it had taken a long toll. In 2004, she disclosed publicly that she had been diagnosed with congestive heart failure, a condition in which the heart gradually loses the ability to pump blood effectively to the rest of the body. It was a chronic, progressive illness, and it had been building for years. She also had crippling spinal problems that left her in near constant pain. By her later years, she relied on a wheelchair for mobility, though she continued to make public appearances and remained, in many ways, recognizably herself, sharp, funny, warm, and entirely unwilling to become a diminished version of who she had been. At an early birthday celebration in January 2011, she told the gathered friends and family, with characteristic wit, "I'm not dead yet." In February 2011, she was admitted to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. Her heart failure had worsened significantly. She spent 6 weeks there, surrounded by her children, as her doctors monitored her condition and her family kept a quiet vigil beside her. Debbie Reynolds, with whom Elizabeth had maintained a friendship in later years, the old bitterness long since dissolved by time and by the recognition that neither of them had been simply the villain or the victim in that old story, said publicly after her death that she was glad Elizabeth was no longer suffering, because the pain had been tremendous. The complications proved insurmountable. On March 23, 2011, Elizabeth Taylor died at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. She was 79 years old. Her son, Michael Wilding, confirmed the news and released a statement describing her as an extraordinary woman who had lived life to the fullest, with great passion, humor, and love. She was buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California. At her request, her funeral started 15 minutes late. She had told her family she wanted to be late to her own funeral. One final, deliberate entrance, entirely on her own terms. After her death, her jewelry collection was auctioned by Christie's, raising a record-breaking $156.8 million, most of which went to benefit the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation. Her clothing and accessories brought in a further $5.5 million. Her perfume line, which she had built into a genuine empire, beginning with Passion in 1987 and White Diamonds in 1991, had earned her more money than her entire acting career. It continued long after she was gone. It is difficult to summarize a life like hers, and perhaps it would be wrong to try too hard. She was a child star who became a genuine actress, not despite the cameras but through them. She was a woman who loved deeply and suffered publicly and kept choosing to get back up. She was married 8 times, widowed once, and somehow emerged from all of it with 4 children who described her as full of warmth and with a foundation still fighting long after she was gone. The American Film Institute placed her 7th on their list of the greatest female film legends of all time. She had won 2 Academy Awards, received 5 nominations, won a Golden Globe, and been made a Dame of the British Empire. She had appeared in more than 50 films over more than 6 decades. But the numbers don't really explain it. They never do, with someone like her. She once said she had no regrets about the way she had lived, that she had been ruled by her passion and had accepted the consequences of that. And right up until the end, that seemed to be true. She had told her family she wanted to be late to her own funeral, 15 minutes late on a cold March morning in Glendale, California. One final entrance, entirely on her own term. That detail says more than most eulogies ever could. If you found this story worth your time, a like and a subscribe go a long way. They help us keep making videos like this one. We'll see you in the next one.